Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 24, Episode 9, The Raid on Medway, 1667. We all know that Britain was last successfully invaded in 1066, when William the Conqueror defeated the Saxon King Harold at Hastings, but that does not mean the shores of Albion have not since been attacked. In 1797 the French landed a small force near Fishguard in Wales and were ignominiously forced to surrender. In 1914 a German naval squadron sailed along the north-east coast and bombarded the towns of Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool. Though no landing was attempted, it caused widespread consternation. A more successful attack was made in 1667 by the Dutch. They sailed up the river Medway, which flows into the Thames estuary, attacking British ships whilst they were in dock. It proved to be a crushing defeat for the Royal Navy. The Dutch, like the English, were vying to be the major maritime nation. This would be the source of friction for both countries in the first two AngloDutch Wars between 1652 through to 1667. During the first AngloDutch War, both countries had fought each other at sea. The resulting peace treaty did not solve the issues of trade, where each country competed with one another. Though the Dutch fleet had suffered in the First War, it had recovered quickly, with 60 new ships being ordered at the end of those hostilities, and yet more ships of the line ordered with the renewed outbreak of hostilities. The opening battle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War was off the English coast, 40 miles east of the Suffolk port of Lowestoft in 1665. The two fleets were numerically similar, but the Royal Navy had more large ships of the line. These were able to take whatever the smaller Dutch ships threw at them, whilst at the same time a broadside delivered from one would wreck the smaller Dutch vessels. It proved to be a confusing engagement. The wind dropped at one point, bringing ships to a standstill. In the end, the English carried the day. It was one of the worst defeats the Dutch had suffered. But the Dutch had already embarked upon a shipbuilding programme, concentrating on heavier ships. The following year, in 1666, the Duke of Albemarle, commanding a British fleet, came across the Dutch under Michiel de Ruyter. The 4 days battle would be one of the longest naval engagements in history, with neither side keen on giving up. When the English finally withdrew, the Dutch failed to follow. Both sides claimed victory. The final major engagement of the war was the 2-day Battle of St. James's Day off the coast of Kent. The Dutch were once more defeated, with a large loss of life, but crucially their fleet was able to escape destruction. Charles in England could not financially afford for the war to drag on. With 2 victories, he felt Britain was in a strong position, so made approaches for a peace settlement. To drive the strength of their position home, a rogue Dutch captain, Laurens Heemskerk, told the British of around 200 Dutch merchantmen sheltering under the protection of just 2 Dutch men of war. The British Rear Admiral Sir Robert Holme took 5 fireships and a number of smaller men of war and attacked. First, the 2 Dutch warships were taken out. Then the British turned their attentions to the merchantmen, most of which had been abandoned by their crews. At least 140 and perhaps as many as 170 Dutch merchant ships were destroyed. The next day, landing troops, the nearby town of Terschelling was attacked and a number of buildings burnt to the ground. Rather than weaken the Dutch negotiating position, Admiral Holmes's action galvanised the nation into doggedly carrying on the fight into 1667. In Britain, the Crown was out of money. 2 years of war had emptied the coffers. King Charles II had few options. His line of credit was limited, with few willing to loan the Crown money, and those that did would only do so at a high rate of interest. Charles was unwilling to ask Parliament to raise taxes to pay for the war. He felt, in doing so, they may ask for a say in how the war was fought. This sharing of power may denude his own authority. Charles's financial situation was not helped by other domestic problems. The Great Plague had swept across the country in the previous couple of years. In 18 months it was estimated that the last of the great bubonic plagues in Britain killed around 100,000 of London's inhabitants, a quarter of the city's population. Just as the effects of the plague were ebbing away in 1666, the Great Fire started at a bakery on Pudding Lane, decimated huge swathes of the city, destroying 70,000 homes. No one expected the naval dockyard at Chatham to be attacked. Its location had been chosen for its ability to offer safe harbour. At this time it was the most important dockyard for the Royal Navy. Located up the River Medway, an attacker would have to sail through the busy Thames estuary and into the confines of the Medway. This not an easy river to navigate. It was defended with a chain across the river, preventing ships sailing through, and with shore batteries and forts on the river banks. It was for this reason all the great ships of the fleet were in harbour at Chatham, temporarily decommissioned due to lack of money, their guns removed and stored ashore. It was expected to be a safe harbour. For all that, the defences were not what they might first seem. Lack of money meant there were relatively few troops garrisoned to defend the river, and the new forts were still being constructed. The only serious defensive position was Upnor Castle, an Elizabethan artillery fort located on the west bank of the River Medway. By 1667 it was outdated and badly provisioned. Samuel Pepys, the secretary to the Navy Board, noted in his diary of the action at the castle, "I do not see that Upnor Castle hath received any hurt by them, though they played long against it, and they themselves shot till they had hardly a gun left upon the carriages, so badly provided they were." The raid might have been daring, but it was a calculated risk. Those leading the raid were not on a suicide mission. The aim was not to win the war, but to effect the peace settlement, more in the favour of the Dutch. The Dutch had carried on building up their fleet over the winter months, and in June, when Admiral de Ruyter arrived with the fleet in the Thames estuary, they had around 60 ships. Their first move was to seize control of the fort protecting the mouth of the River Medway at Sheerness. A number of Dutch ships engaged it with cannon fire, and it wasn't long before the bulk of the garrison, already suffering low morale, fled. Those that remained soon took flight in the face of the 800 Dutch marines that had been put ashore. The British were not at all prepared for a raid so close to home, and only a small number of Royal Navy ships were available locally. 2 days after capture of the fort at Sheerness, the Dutch made to move up the River Medway. Overnight, the British had hastily put across the huge chain to prevent Dutch men-of-war moving upstream, and sunk a number of ships in an attempt to block the channel. The vast chain across the channel was such a weight it sat 9 feet deep in the water at its lowest point. The defenders struggled to pull it tighter. As such, a shallow draught vessel could sail over it. It was Dutch Captain Jan Daniels van Rijn that broke the chain. It's disputed how, but he may well have sailed across it. Irrespective, once through, their path was relatively open. Fire ships attacked the 3 ships guarding the chain, which were captured or destroyed. It had been planned that behind the chain was to be a barrier of 3 block ships, vessels, scuttled, blocking the river channel. 2 were scuttled in the right place, but the 3rd ran aground and never reached its correct position, leaving a critical gap. Through this gap the Dutch sailed on to reach 4 of the largest battleships, which the British had failed to move upriver to a safer mooring. The crew of the flagship, the Royal Charles, fled, abandoning her to the enemy. She was a large first-rate ship of the line, though only 30 of her 80 guns were actually on board. The 3 other large ships were scuttled before they could be seized. To prevent the British later salvaging them, the Dutch set fire to them. Seeing disaster unfold, and with nothing to counter the attack, further warships upriver were scuttled to prevent them falling into Dutch hands and making the river difficult to navigate, especially as they would need to pass the guns at Upnor Castle. At the end of the day, the British had sunk a total of 35 English ships deliberately by themselves. Most humiliating of all, the flagship Royal Charles, as well as the 42-gun HMS Unity, were captured and towed back to the Netherlands as a prize. During this raid on the Medway, the Dutch Marines had strict orders not to plunder or destroy any civilian property. This was to shame the English for the destruction during Holmes's raid the previous year. Samuel Pepys understood the message when he wrote in his diary on the 30th of June 1667, "It seems very remarkable to me, and of great honour to the Dutch, that those of them that did go on shore to Gillingham, though they went in fear of their lives, and were some of them killed, and notwithstanding their provocation at shelling, yet killed none of our people, nor plundered their houses, but did take some things of easy carriage, and left the rest, and not a house burned, and, which is to our eternal disgrace, that what my Lord Douglas's men, who come after them, found there, they plundered and took all away." Not only would the raid prove to be an astonishing victory militarily for the Dutch, they virtually controlled the seas around the south coast of England. Peace negotiations, now initiated by the English, proceeded with haste. The Dutch had achieved their objective of swinging the negotiations back in their favour. It took just 10 days for the talks to conclude with the Treaty of Breda. Pepys would write, "Thus in all things, in wisdom, courage, force, knowledge of our own streams and success, the Dutch have the best of us, and do end the war with victory on their side." What the Anglo-Dutch War proved was that you needed money to fight a war, and lots of it. Without that, you could have no effective force to fight with. For every warship the English built during the conflict, the Dutch shipyards turned out 7. The Dutch crown had a good line of credit. The English did not. This would be something that would be driven home later in the same century, this time losing at the hands of the French, which would lead directly to the creation of the Bank of England, one of the first central banks created to control a government's money supply and currency. In retrospect, the British might have got off lightly. If the Dutch had landed troops and attacked the Royal Dockyard, they could have wreaked havoc on the dock's facilities, whilst an attempt to do so would not have gone unopposed. Considering the circumstances, they would have had a good chance of succeeding. But was it in their long-term interests to hamstring the Royal Navy when the real threat was the French? In a decade, the two countries would indeed be allies against the French King Louis XIV. Do remember that Angus has his very own podcast on the subject of World War II, and you can find that at www.podcast.com. And we also produce a number of other podcasts. We produced a podcast for Ancient Warfare magazine. You can find them at ancient-warfare.com. And we also produce another couple of podcasts, one for War Games, Soldiers and Strategy, and we do one for the Medieval Warfare podcast as well. You can find out about all of these either on our Facebook page, just search for The History Network on Facebook, or at the website thehistorynetwork.org, where you will also find our store where you can buy any of our previous seasons to download as a chaptered file for listening, and they are just £2 each. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace read by Nick Barker.